Hey everybody, welcome to For the Record, which is a conversation series presented by Grey Matter where we talk to music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. It's great to have you here, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, would love to, start at the beginning and dive way back in. I know we've kind of had this conversation in the past, but love to hear it again. I think it's a good story and hear about like when your relationship with music started, where you grew up, and then kind of work our way forward from there.
I was born in Detroit, but my family are from the UK, and they were living in Detroit for a few years when I was born in the mid '80s. My dad had a job out there, and then they moved back to London when I was only about 2.5 or 3. So I remember very little of Detroit. And I grew up in London, and music was there right from the beginning. My family is very musical. My mum is a music teacher her whole life, spent teaching music, and I've got 2 brothers who are both musicians as well, and my mum ran this big band, like community big band that is still going. It's been going for about 45 years now, and they meet every week on a Tuesday evening in the same church hall that they've been meeting in for over 4 decades. When we were growing up, all 3 of us, my brothers and I, would often go along to these rehearsals. So there'd be 20 odd musicians with these really shiny instruments playing through this amazing music like Duke Ellington charts and Count Basie and a load of Neil Hefti charts and Glenn Miller and some stuff which, looking back on now, probably isn't the peak of big band music, but at the time it was just like this glorious sound and sight as well. Just the sight of all these instruments like baritone saxophone. Imagine being like a 3 or 4 year old kid and you're seeing someone blow into this enormous shiny metal tube. It's just like and the sound that it makes, Yeah. So actually there's a hilarious picture of my brother who's now a saxophone player, sneaking up while one of the saxophone players had their sax on a stand, so it was on the floor, and he's like, it's only an alto sax, I think, and he's kind of on his tiptoes just to try and get to the mouthpiece. It's a really cute picture. But yeah, 30 something years later, we're all playing music. We're all heavily into jazz, and we've all studied jazz in depth. It's a big part of our musical language. So I think that goes right back to hearing those instruments at a really young age and hearing that music. I still love Duke Ellington and Basie and all of that glorious music that came through through that big band. So I think that's where a lot of the kind of magic started for me. I think I probably was going to those rehearsals before I even started playing an instrument. I picked up the guitar when I was about 6, and that was the age at my school when you were allowed to start learning an instrument. And the choice at the time was between piano, guitar, and flute. And my mum was actually the piano teacher at the school, so I was like, there's no way I'm doing piano. She was teaching me a little bit of piano at home. I wasn't really taking to it, so she was like, well, why don't you try another instrument? So it was a choice between guitar and flute. And I just thought, guitar goes really loud, flute is, so I chose guitar. It was a classical guitar at the time, so I was learning to read music, I was learning classical repertoire, which I'm really grateful for now. I don't really play that music anymore, but I did go through a phase where that was mostly what I was studying. I was learning to play classical music on the guitar, and it definitely informed the way that I still play guitar now. I had a show last month actually in London, and it was an improv concert, improvised music with my trio, my Polish trio. But someone came up in the interval and said, like, oh, do you have a classical background? And they could just tell that there was something about probably the right hand technique, maybe, and some of the sort of ways I was voicing chords, maybe. But I think it's still there in my playing, even when I'm playing stuff that's on the surface so far removed from that music. I still practice a bit of Bach every now and again just to kind of keep the chops up, and I love that music. I don't really perform it anymore. I don't feel I have that much to add to all of the great recordings that are out there of that music. But yeah, that came into my life about age 6, and then I was learning classical repertoire and I was studying for grades and everything, but I would do that and then I would basically just switch to improvising. At the time, I didn't know it was called improvising. It was just kind of doing stuff that wasn't written down. But that's what I really enjoyed, and I was like discovering new sounds on the instrument, and I didn't realize, that some of those sounds would now be called extended techniques and all this stuff. But I was just, seeing what I could get out of this box of wood with metal wire across it, or nylon wire. At that time it was a nylon string. And I think just those hours and hours and hours that I spent just exploring this instrument with no idea really of what I was doing is still a huge kind of spark of creativity. I just love to sit down and just see what can come out of nothing. And then at the same time, I was trying to remember some of these things that I'd been doing on the instrument. So like I'd be improvising for a while, and then I'd think, I should really remember that because I really like it. And that's where I think the idea of wanting to compose came in. So it was just an idea of wanting to distill some of the ideas that I was discovering in real time so that I could recall them at a later stage. So I wasn't writing anything down yet, but probably around the age of 14, I started writing down ideas. Like I already had this background in notation, so I was like, well, if other people can write their musical ideas down and I'll play them, maybe I should write my ideas down and then I can remember them later. So I started writing these down just on like loose sheets of manuscript paper, and started to collect them in a little folder. And so it was mainly just fragments, like little ideas, and then combining them with other ideas. So that process of learning to compose was very organic, and it really came out of improvising and exploring the instrument. So it was very tied to the guitar at first. By this time, I was pretty serious about music. So I guess in my mid-teens, I got obsessed with jazz and classical music, probably around the same time. Listening to classical music that wasn't just guitar music, so orchestral music and string quartets, sonatas, and so on. But also really, really obsessed with jazz. Probably starting with the more contemporary end of things and then working my way back. One of the things that I love to do, when I found something that I liked listening to, I was like, where does this music come from? So I wanted to know who had inspired the musicians on that record or the composers of the music. And through that process, I kind of traced back the history of jazz, Black American music. Yeah, I was actually, I know that one of the questions later on is going to be about discovery. So I was noting down some of the ways that I was remembering finding out about that. Because at the time, this was around 2000.
Right.
Like internet music discovery wasn't really a thing. I do remember allmusic.com had one of those. It was one of the earliest kind of recommendation engines. If you like this artist, you might like this one. And also they would list credits on albums. So, I would like, this was the time when I was buying CDs. So there had been a cassette era before that, but I was into CDs at this time. So I'd be poring over the liner notes, seeing who was playing on the records. And then if there was a musician that really stood out on one record, I'd be looking on AllMusic to see what else they'd played on and then get one of their records. And so again, it was this very organic process of just following my ear to see where it took me and what I could learn and what music I could discover. And I do remember like 2 massive books that I had that I was also using as discovery tools. And there was the Penguin Guide to Jazz, that was kind of an encyclopedia with basically every famous jazz artist up until that time, which was I guess it was published in the late 90s. Sort of a paragraph on each, or if they were particularly notable, then 2 or 3 paragraphs. And then a couple of key recordings that obviously I would then try and get on CD. And then the one for classical, I think it was the Gramophone magazine Guide to Classical Music or something like that. And it was like, you know, if you're interested in a particular piece, it was the recording of that piece that they would recommend. So I guess they would say these are the definitive recordings of pieces. I don't really believe in the idea of a definitive recording, but it was useful at that time to be like, okay, I want to learn more about Olivier Messiaen, for example. Which recording should I buy of Quartet for the End of Time? This kind of thing. So those are 2 big books. You know, like Wikipedia for music, I don't remember it being a thing at that time. It might have been, but it certainly was nowhere near what it is now. So those were the main ways I was learning about music. And at the time I was starting to play with other people as well. I'd always been playing music with my brothers. Again, before we knew that it was called improvising, that's basically what we would do for hours on end, just in the front room where all the instruments were, just jamming, you know. And we never even used to talk about it. Like, it wasn't even, I don't remember even saying like, oh, do you want to go and jam? It was just like, there was just this unspoken, I don't know, maybe it was a look or a nod or some kind of secret language, but we would just find ourselves in that room with our instruments. And then hours later we'd emerge and something really magical had happened, but we wouldn't even say anything about it. It was just like part of our lives, you know. So again, I think that's where a lot of the magic that I associate with playing in a band comes from. It's just these hours and hours and hours that we spent coming up with stuff out of thin air. So then I guess by the end of school I was doing quite a bit of music, but I was at the time my idea of rebelling was not going into music because everybody in my family was doing music. So I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be a translator. I wanted to translate literature. I was really into languages, French and Spanish, and I had this kind of quite naive idea of particularly South American literature, because I loved people like Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende. Like, I had this idea that I would somehow unearth like books or novels or poetry from Latin America that hadn't yet been translated into English, and I would be the one to do that. But like my French and my Spanish weren't that good because I wanted to do French as well. I'd done it in school, I'd had French lessons, but I wasn't a native speaker. I wasn't bilingual or trilingual. So I had applied to Edinburgh University to do French and Hispanic studies with the idea of then going into translation. But I had changed schools, and the school that I went to didn't do Spanish, so I didn't have Spanish A-level. I didn't get into Edinburgh. So I had this gap year when I was like, well, I guess that's not going to work out. What shall I do? And one of the formative things that happened in that year was that I spent a couple of months traveling around France, still with this idea of getting my French up to a really good level. And I happened to meet a translator, and he said to me, you know, the majority of what we do is like business documents. Unless you're a native speaker from birth, there's no way you're going to be able to translate literature. So that was a bit of a crush to my dreams. But at this time, we were kind of busking around France. It was me and my older brother, Nick. I had my guitar. He had a saxophone. There was a percussionist friend of ours. And we were meeting up with people along the way. We basically spent 2 months busking around France and met some amazing people, played in some amazing places. And at the end of it, I think I realized I just wanted to do that. I just wanted to play music, hang out with people, have great experiences that I was having at the time. So then I decided to switch and to study music. And for my undergrad, I went down to the southwest of England, to a place called Dartington College of Arts, which at the time was in a town called Totnes in Devon. It's since moved away, which is a shame because the estate that it was on was this beautiful, I think 13th century kind of landscaped gardens with this old banquet hall and like a 500-year-old oak tree. Maybe it was even older than that, but this like really majestic tree in the churchyard outside the banquet hall. It was like a beautiful place. These original Henry Moore sculptures and Barbara Hepworth sculptures in the gardens, on the River Dart, where there were amazing walks. Really idyllic place to spend a few years. I was there for 4 years, studying composition by now, so I'd kind of decided that was going to be my pathway. But my focus for my dissertation and my portfolio of work that supported that was on composing for improvisers, or at least the different ways that improvisation can be used in conjunction with composition. And that's always been a real thread running through a lot of my work, before and since. So I was looking at the ways that composers worked with improvisers, the ways that musicians use improvisation in their own compositional processes, trying to look at that from as many different angles as possible, and then coming up with a body of work that I would then kind of take out into the field, as it were. We had to do this project in our last year, and the idea was basically to go somewhere else and do a project and then come back and tell us about it. And it could be months long. I think it was like 3-month project. So I went to Dublin at the time, where my older brother was living, and he was already doing music there and in lots of bands and stuff. So I went to stay with him, and I put a band together with him, my other brother, who's a drummer, and then bass and trombone. And I wrote a whole load of music for this quintet. And that was my portfolio for my undergrad, basically. And then dissertation around like some of the music I was exploring that supported that. And then I stayed down in Devon for another year after college, came back up to London, and just kind of dove in to London scene. I was teaching guitar quite a bit at the time, and then a couple of years along the line, I decided I wanted to do a master's degree in jazz, just to kind of support that side of things. Because at that time, although I was like an obsessive jazz listener, my chops and my understanding of actually how to play that music were pretty basic. They were like, I was self-taught as a kind of improvising musician, and I wanted a bit more structure around that. So I applied to the Royal Academy of Music thinking there's no way I'm going to get in, but that seems to be the place where I want to go and do my master's. It's a pretty selective course for the MA. There's like one person on every instrument, sometimes not even that.
Wow.
And I was like, well, there's no way, out of all the people applying, I'm going to be the one guitarist that they let in. But I just thought, if nothing else, it's going to force me to really practice for the audition, which I did. Like those months that I spent practicing leading up to that audition, having lessons with some of the people that actually teach on that jazz course there, I probably just kind of progressed more than any time up until that point. And luckily I got in, and I was one of 5 people on the master's course that year. So it was guitar, voice, saxophone, 2 piano players, and that's 5 of us. And that was my year group. There was a lot of like combinations with the undergrads as well. But yeah, I spent 2 years at the Royal Academy there. Just loved it. Went really deep into so many aspects of music. Was just playing all day, starting to do loads of gigs, forming bands. And I consider that period, by this time it's about, so it was 2010 that I started there. So for 2 years to 2012. And then for a few years after that, I feel like that's where my background is musically, in terms of the people that I'm still making music with and kind of scene that I came up through. It was very much the London improvised music scene, the jazz scene. And during that time formed some of the first bands that I would make records with. So at the time I had a band called Blue Eyed Hawk, which was a quartet with voice, trumpet, guitar, drums. Kind of song-based music, but with a lot of improvisation as well. Lots of music based on poems. The name of the band came from a Yeats poem, for example. We did some settings of Heaney poems. So a very kind of literary approach to improvising. And then for the last 10 years, I guess, since then, I've focused more on my own projects, starting my own bands. Did a lot of composing for other ensembles, so I was still like writing music that I wouldn't necessarily play myself for all kinds of things, ranging from like solo cello through to full orchestra, choir, chamber groups, improvising ensembles, and then decided to focus more on like just the bands that I was in, writing music for those. Been in loads of bands since then. Some have lasted, some haven't. Right now, probably the 2 or 3 main ones that I'm focused on is my Polish trio, because in 2018 I moved to Poland from London. So I've been living in Kraków for the last 5 or 6 years now. And I have a band here that's a trio with clarinet and drums. And again, it takes me right back to growing up in a household where my brothers played saxophone and drums. This idea of reeds, guitar, and drums are just somehow in my DNA, and I sort of gravitate towards that a bit. So I've rekindled that a bit with this band, and we put out a record a couple of months ago. The band is called Cut the Sky. So that's been my main focus recently. And then also last year I put out a record with MultiTraction Orchestra, which is I call it a networked ensemble. It's basically a remote recording project with a fluid lineup of musicians. So did one track during the pandemic, which is where this idea came from, with 27 different musicians around the world, and loved doing it. It was a really cool process. It was total experiment. I'd never done a remote recording thing before. I think most people hadn't up until that point, but suddenly figured out how to do it, and had a lot of fun putting this track together. And off the back of that, I realized actually I'd really like to do more stuff like that. So ended up making a whole album in a similar vein, but this time with a smaller group, and that record was called Reactor 1 that came out last year. I guess that's pretty much getting us up to date. Maybe another strand that I'll mention is I write quite a lot of music for interdisciplinary projects, particularly for dance performances. So dance and theatre, some film as well, film scores. And I love doing that. And I've done a few records based on music that I've written for dance scores. And that actually was the basis for forming or founding Zimpel, which is a label that I started for music that was created for interdisciplinary projects. So the EP that released on that was called Inpouring, and that was based on a dance score that I'd composed. The idea just with that is contextualizing that music with the other disciplines that were involved. So put out a season of releases involving poetry and choreography and videography and animation and drawing, but tied together through the music and through the way that we released them. That brings us pretty much up to date, I think.
To the present day. Cool. Thank you for sharing. And it was, of course, through Zyla that, we first connected. And as you were sharing your story, I was taking some notes and thinking about, kind of the common thread that, across your interests about like through literature and improvisation and music, wanting to get into translation, but then also kind of doing that, like with your bands, like translating poetry into music, almost like taking, these lyrics and this prose, or sorry, not prose, poetry, and applying, and getting into kind of the interdisciplinary side and working in more of in what feels like a very fluid way across, arts and technique, which I think was really cool. I mean, I'm curious because you talked about like when you were improvising as a kid, when you were playing around with what you would learn would be called extended techniques. those moments when you discover that there was like some canon, for these things. There was, there's already precedence. Like, who are the people that you first saw, or who you first came across, and then what did that feel like when you could kind of contextualize your experience within kind of a larger framework?
The people that come to mind immediately are people like Derek Bailey, who's one of the kind of all-time great improvising guitarists, who probably mostly uses extended techniques. If he plays a note, it's kind of like, oh, that's unusual. I'm exaggerating slightly, but yeah, certainly like just someone that really explored what you can do with a guitar. And mostly kind of, nowadays, like a lot of guitar players who are searching for less conventional sounds will gravitate towards effects and pedals. With Derek Bailey, most of it is just in the fingers. And that's what that really struck me at the time, because I was playing acoustic guitar exclusively up until I was about I think I got an electric guitar when I was like 11, but I wasn't really into pedals and effects boards and everything. So I was still basically playing with the same kinds of techniques that I developed on acoustic or classical guitar. And Derek Bailey was someone that I really looked to as someone who'd really explored just what you can do with the instrument before you even plug it in. And then, of course, when I realized that you could plug it in through all these pedals, I was like, okay, there's a whole other school of guitarists that are really into that. And people like Fred Frith would be one. Robert Fripp from King Crimson. I think in my teens, like one of the other strands of music that was really important to me was my mum's partner would tell me about all these records that he'd been listening to in the 70s. And he's been really into like prog rock. So bands like King Crimson, and that was the band that I really loved out of all the stuff that he played me. He was really into Zappa as well, Frank Zappa. But I was really drawn to King Crimson, like the writing of the tunes, the way that the guitar and all the other instruments were used to orchestrate the pieces, and Robert Fripp's guitar playing. So then I was kind of looking into his solo stuff a bit more. His Frippatronics stuff with Brian Eno. It was kind of early ambient explorations. That was really, really important to me. And then in a more kind of jazz context, people like Bill Frisell, hugely important to me. Actually, as preparation for this, I was looking at Brody's interview, and I'm so happy that he mentioned the Frisell album Big Sur, because I love that record. And it's, when people say they're into Frisell, they don't often mention that record. There are some others that are sort of better known, or but I love that one from, I think it was around 2012. Beautiful record. So yeah, Bill Frisell is still a huge kind of icon of the guitar for me. And people like Ben Monder, who's in some ways similar to Frisell, but also has a whole other thing going on. But yeah, someone that has unbelievable technique just on the instrument, but can also feed it through a whole bunch of effects. He was actually on the last David Bowie record. He's on Black Star.
Cool.
So a lot of the kind of really spacey guitar sounds that you hear on that is Ben Monder. But I knew him before that as like an improvising guitarist on the New York scene, playing with people like David Binney and Craig Taborn and people like that. So actually, now I've mentioned that New York downtown scene, I have to mention Tim Byrne, because although he's not a guitarist, he's someone whose bands have included most of my favorite guitarists of the last few decades. Like, especially, I have to mention Marc Ducré. Marc Ducré is a French guitarist who I first heard playing with Tim Byrne. Tim Byrne's a New York saxophone player and composer. I think of him as a little bit like a kind of modern day Miles Davis, in the sense that his bands are so important to kind of launching other musicians' careers. Like, if you've been through a Tim Byrne band, you've kind of like, you've got to a point where people are going to be paying attention, and then you can do your own solo thing. Like,
Right.
that's quite rare these days to have someone who's just a magnet for creative musicians of all different
Mhm.
persuasions. But if you follow
It's
Tim
true.
Burns' career from the kind of late 70s through to modern day, like, so many incredible musicians have come through his bands, and Mark Ducray was one of them. Unbelievable guitarist, both acoustic and electric. He was someone else who just blew my mind in terms of what you could do on the instrument. Still, I have no idea how he does some of what he does. Like, and I've seen him play a bunch of times, and I've studied with him even in New York a little bit, and I just have no idea how he does it. So he's someone else that was a really big influence. I think that, yeah, I think of it like those 4 or 5 guitarists were really big for me. Frizzell, Fripp, Vermonde, Fred Frith, Mark Ducray, probably the bastion for me, and Derek Bailey as well.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, I love that. I'm glad you mentioned King Crimson. Yeah, I went through a big King Crimson phase. I think, when I was in high school as well. I remember like hearing in the Court of the Crimson King.
Classic.
Yeah, I don't know where exactly I heard it for the first time, because I'm from a small town in Minnesota, so there was like basically our offerings for radio stations was like classic rock, top 40 and country music, and maybe on like an obscure late night thing on one of the classic rock stations they may have played that. But anyway, yeah, they're great. But yeah, I mean, speaking of discovery, you mentioned back in the early aughts of using things like AllMusic to try to discover music and to help you contextualize what you would then go on to purchase. Of course, things have changed since then, and how we primarily consume music and discover it. And somehow, even though we have everything at our fingertips, like a lot of the context and typical discovery routes have kind of been abstracted away from the music itself, which is really unfortunate. So I'm curious, how your process of discovery has evolved since then, and what you do today.
I'm really glad you mentioned this word context, because I'm all about that, and I know that it's a big part of what you're doing with Crate Coalition. Some of the other stuff you're doing is about bringing back context, and I'm so aligned with that, because it's what I miss about the way that we do discover and listen to music now. It is stripped of context, and context is everything. It's everything.
It's important.
It's everything. So music doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context. Every piece of music that's ever been played, let alone recorded, comes out of somewhere, and it's to do with people, it's to do with places, it's to do with other stuff that's happening at the time. And I don't think music should be removed from being embedded in context. So I'm totally aligned with this move to bring context back. So I think at the time, going back sort of 20 odd years, it was like physical media. So the encyclopedias that I mentioned, or like I remember when I got to university for my undergrad, they had the complete set of the Grove Dictionary of Music, which is like, it takes up an entire bookshelf, volumes and volumes this thick of just like, I mean, it was kind of Victorian. I think it had been started actually in the Victorian era, so it's pretty outdated by this time. But still, it had been updated over the intervening years, and that was just like magic to me. Imagine having just this, what seemed like an infinite resource. Obviously, it's not infinite. It sits on a bookshelf, so it's got a limited number of pages. But like, you're never going to get through it all. And this was basically, wasn't pre-internet, but it was before the internet became the resource that it is now. I mean, I remember one of our first sessions at university was like how to do an internet search. Went into the library and it's like how to search on the internet, because we just didn't know. It was completely new at the time.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
yeah, like being able to go on AllMusic and just follow the thread from, you know, Art Blakey to Wayne Shorter to Miles Davis to blah blah blah. That was a really important discovery tool. And then the other thing I mentioned, you know, looking in the liner notes, and that's where a lot of the context was kind of crystallized. So I would obsess over liner notes. I'd sit there, I'd buy a CD. I used to go to HMV on Oxford Street in London, and every kind of month or two, I'd have saved up enough money to buy like a small handful of CDs. So I would have
Mhm.
these like really long lists of CDs that I'd noted down that I needed to get next. And I'd get to HMV and there'd just be a whole jazz department and a whole classical department. And I'd be like, I'd spend hours in there trying to whittle down my choices to the number of CDs that I could afford to buy. And then, of course, I'd come home with maybe 4 or 5 CDs. That was going to be my listening for the next couple of months. And I would
Mhm.
obsess over every aspect of them, sitting there with the
Mhm.
liner notes, like on every track. Okay, who's soloing on that one? Or if it was a classical one, you know, reading the kind of essay and the liner notes about the form of the piece, the structure of it, the historical context, where the composer had been when they'd written this symphony, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And, you know, that was all written in liner notes, and we basically don't have that anymore. Unless you can be bothered to follow a link through to a Bandcamp page where sometimes there's a description. But I did love that about physical media. And of course the artwork as well, such a big part of it, which now is just reduced to like this tiny little square on a screen.
Exactly.
Other physical media, like we had a subscription to The Wire magazine for a while. So
Mhm.
that seems to be where like a lot of the stuff I was listening to, that's where they would be writing about it. So discovered some stuff through The Wire. And, you know, it seems mad to me now that I would buy a CD purely on the basis of a review in The Wire magazine. But I did. I used to read about something and be like, that sounds like something I would genuinely like. And most of the
Yeah.
time, it was. I remember
Mhm.
specifically discovering Akira Rabelais through The Wire. And it's still someone that I've never basically seen mentioned anywhere else. And I know very little about Akira Rabelais. I think it's a pseudonym for an electronic producer. But it's really haunting, ghostly music that I find very powerful, and discovered that through The Wire completely, you know, out of nowhere. Didn't know the name, hadn't heard anything else, still know very little about them. But that was the power of music writing for me at the time. It's like if you know who to read, who to listen to, you can trust those people. And over time you kind of get an idea of, okay, who do I trust as a music journalist? So there's still journalists, you know, who I follow because I know what they're into, and I trust their taste. I trust that it's aligned with my own. And so now that physical media isn't so much of a thing in my own kind of discovery process, yeah, I got a bunch of subscriptions to people's Substacks who's writing about music I really like, or maybe I know that they're writing about particular kinds of music that I'm really interested in. So I actually noted down a few because I wanted to remember the ones that I really liked. There's Peter Margasak, who also writes for Bandcamp. He does the Bandcamp Best of Contemporary Classical Bandcamp Daily column. He's got a Substack called Nowhere Street, which is really great. Steve Smith is based in New York and has one called Night After Night. It's mainly New York based, so it's listings for concerts, but also recordings, and like a kind of release schedule of probably the overlap between contemporary classical and improvised music and sort of experimental jazz. Ted Gioia, who's probably a better known writer, has one called The
Love
Honest
that.
Broker. And that's he writes sometimes more about the context than the music itself. I think his latest one, or one I read the other day, was about this trumpet player called Dupre Bolton, who had disappeared in the 50s and nobody knew where he was, and he tracked him down. So it's like the story of tracking down this virtuosic kind of prodigal trumpet player who was on a couple of records in the 50s and completely disappeared. Everybody who came into contact with him was just blown away, and then everyone was like, where did he go, you know? So stories like that, which I find really interesting. Music X, you probably know, is Bas Grasmeyer and Martin Wallraven, I think is how to pronounce his name. Again, that's more like writing about the music industry and how it intersects with others, but then at the end there'll be a music recommendation. And one thing I like about that is I like that it's just one album every time, rather than like, here's everything I've heard in the last month that you need to go and check out, because I find that a bit overwhelming, especially if you've got loads of different Substacks that you're reading, you know. So
12 of them. Yeah.
it's a lot, but I like the fact that they just do one. And then Bandcamp Daily is a good resource. I follow a bunch of artists on Bandcamp, so every time they pop up in one of these stories, I get an email saying, Tim Byrne is recommended in this month's column, so I'll go and check that out, see who else they're writing about. And probably the other way that I discover a load of music, well, there's probably two. One way that's happened more recently is because I've put out a couple of records in the last year. People are putting them on playlists and playing them on the radio and stuff, and tagging me, and I will always check out their playlist or radio show and see what else they're playing or listening to. And almost always I find something that I like, you know, because if it's someone listening to my music, like, they're obviously into the similar kind of thing that I am. So I've found that a really beautiful way to discover music, because it's coming from the people that are actually listening to my music. Or similarly, when people come up at a gig and they're like, oh, do you know this record? Because you reminded me at some point of this thing. And I'll be like, no, I've literally never heard of that artist, but I will always go in and check it out. That's been really nice over the last year or two. And the one other one is, I am a total sucker for end of year lists. I know a lot of people don't like them, but I obsess over them. I make my own ones. I don't always share them, but I make my own ones. I go onto a website called albumoftheyear.org. I think it's .org. And it like collates all the other end of year lists, and they create like a kind of meta list. It's a bit like the way IMDb does meta scores or Metacritic scores or whatever they call it. So it's like compiling all the other end of year lists into one meta list. But they will also just like link to all the individual lists as well. So, you know, the Wire end of year list, the Quietus, which is a great online music publication. And basically what I do is I go through these lists, everything that I think sounds interesting or that I'd missed when I was listening during the course of the previous year, I stick on a playlist, and then that's basically my listening for the next year. Of course, I'm adding stuff to playlists throughout the year as well. You know, when someone tells me about something, or I discover it via one of these other methods, I'm sticking it on a playlist. I have playlists by year, so like 2024 releases, 2023 releases, and I'm going through that when I want to check out something new. So I'm very obsessive about playlists and end of year lists, and just like, I love the discovery process. You know, I love all the different ways that you can follow a thread. So I have to be organized with it, otherwise I just forget. You know, I've got something like 2,600 albums on my playlist of stuff to check out. So I'm never going to get through it all, but I can't not keep adding to it. I'm obsessed at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be too much music. There's always going to be more music than we can ever listen to. But I wasn't aware of albumoftheyear.org. I'm definitely going to check that out. I think end of year playlists are, you know, best ofs are well worthwhile, because you don't have time to curate everything yourself, and oftentimes these are done, you know, very thoughtfully by people who spend a lot of time with their music. So I'm a fan. But that's a good segue actually into one of the questions I have for you. Who are 3 artists of note that you've heard for the, you know, first time in the past year-ish?
I was prepared for this, like I said, because I watched Brody's one the other day. And you know, I hate being put on the spot and the thought of like forgetting about something that I've actually discovered recently. So I put in some thought to it, and actually one of them I think I discovered through the Music X newsletter.
Cool.
I think so. But I know it was in there. I might have actually heard it before that, and then it happened to be in there. But I know that Martin's into it. MC Yalla. MC Yalla is a rapper from, I think she's Kenyan, but she raps in multiple different East African dialects, including Swahili, sometimes in English, but mostly not. And she's just rude. Like, it's the best way I can describe this music is just, it's rude, it's bad music, it's evil, but in the best possible way, you know, like really sick beats. Her delivery is just phenomenal, like sometimes really fast, and just with this vicious energy. Like most of the time I have no idea what she's rapping about because it's mostly not in English, but just the energy of it and the groove to it, the way that it's kind of putting together a lot of strands that I've been hearing coming out of East Africa at the moment, like really fast electronic music. She's kind of connected with this Nyege Nyege label or festival that happens in Uganda, which is somewhere I would love to go for this festival because they have a label as well. It's like a multi-day long rave basically by a river in Uganda, and then they started releasing some of the music that they have from artists at the festival. And some of my other favorite music from the last few years has come out of this label, like bands like Nyaloxica, a lot of stuff from Uganda and Kenya. So I think she started out on that label and then moved to another one. But yeah, and MC Yalla for sure over the last year, big discovery for me. Someone else was technically I didn't discover in the last year, but I really kind of gained a new appreciation of his music. It's Milford Graves, who's a percussionist from, I think, from Chicago or maybe New York, but he actually I can't remember if he's still alive. He might have passed recently. In fact, I think he did pass recently. But I heard this record. My friend recommended it to me, and I knew the name Milford Graves, and I knew that he was really well respected, but I'd heard little bits and pieces. I hadn't really dived in. I never know. But there's this record that's a reissue of some improvisations that he did in his loft. I think at the time in the 70s he had one of these kind of loft. Maybe this was in New York. So it was like a New York loft apartment where they could just like play and record any time of day. And there's something like, 2 or 3 days of recordings that have been reissued, or actually I think issued for the first time, but they're kind of archival recordings. And they're pretty rough recordings. Like you can hear him kind of setting up and saying like, okay, let's go for it, sort of thing. But the music is like blistering. It's mostly drums. I think it's mostly a trio with drums, saxophone, and bass. Arthur Doyle on saxophone. He's just like, so I'd never heard of Arthur Doyle before this one, and he blew me away. It's sort of like post Albert Ayler, sort of free jazz thing, but with this deep spirituality to the music. And Milford Graves is someone who doesn't just play the drums, he kind of plays the universe. Like the universe is his instrument, and he's tapped into all these different wavelengths that just seem to resonate on such a deep level. There's some musicians who have this quality that I am really drawn to, and it's when they just transcend their instrument, they transcend the style of music that they're playing or perceived to be playing in. It's no longer about that. It's no longer even about sound. It's about vibration in the widest sense of the word. And Milford Graves is someone who had that ability to transcend everything, instrument and context, and just like tap into something really universal and powerful. So I would definitely recommend this album that was issued recently. I can't actually remember the name of it. I'll double check. It was let me find it here because it's on my 2023 playlist, I think, of 2023 favorites. So yeah, there it is. It's called Children of the Forest. It's Milford Graves,
Okay.
Arthur Doyle, and Hugh Glover, and it's mostly from 1976. In fact, it's all from 1976. A few days in early 76. Blistering music. So that's one thing that really hit me about Milford Graves. And then the third one, I'm going to go with this band called Shirom, who are from
Shirom.
Slovenia. Shirom, yeah. It's S with an accent, one of these kind of accents. Sirom. And I think they're from Slovenia, and it's a trio, and each of the members in the trio plays multiple different instruments, mostly kind of folk instruments, from different European folk traditions. And they kind of layer up these sort of like post-minimalist but folk-based long meditative pieces.
Cool.
It's really beautiful music, and I've never really heard these instruments used in that way. So it's a kind of really interesting take on like Central European folk traditions. Probably drawing a lot on minimalism and sort of long form improvised music. Beautiful record. It's got a funny name. I think it's so the band is Shirom, and the album, maybe it was from 2022. Yeah, it's called The Liquefied Throne of Simplicity. And all the tracks have similar names, like Wilted Superstition Engaged in Copulation, or Prods the Fire with a Bone, Rolls Over with a Snake. You know, it's like it's a special record. I recommend that one. So those would be my three.
Cool, thank you. I wasn't familiar with any of those, so I look forward to listening to them. Okay, if you can remember, what is the first album that you ever purchased, and then the most recent?
The first album I ever purchased, so I think it would have been on cassette, and this would be like mid 90s. I think it was probably Oasis, to be honest. It's probably Oasis. Cool. Like What's the Story, Morning Glory, or maybe it was Be Here Now. I was kind of into it. Wasn't so much that I was into Oasis. It was almost like being a guitarist and being that age at that time, I was sort of expected to be into Oasis. Like, I mean, even nowadays, which I find bizarre, people are like, "Oh, do you know Wonderwall?" But at the time, of course, Wonderwall was a recent track, so you kind of expected to know. I did actually have at one point a kind of like, the sheet music for a whole bunch of Oasis songs, and I did, I liked it at the time. I don't remember being like super into it. I think on CD, the first CD I bought, and I'm not ashamed to say this, even though a lot of people give this artist a lot of stick, it was Enya. It was Paint the Sky with Stars by Enya. And I think Enya's having a bit of a critical reevaluation right now.
Is
or
she?
Maybe not critical, but like among musicians, because people are often like they give Enya a lot of stick because it's this kind of like, they say it's the cheesy kind of quasi folky, quasi ambient new age is the term that gets leveled against it. But there's a podcaster called Blind Boy. You ever come across this guy? He's an Irish guy. Has a podcast just called the Blind Boy Podcast. And he did one about Enya and about actually how progressive what she was doing was at the time. Like the idea of combining Irish folk music with analog synthesizers in the 80s is pretty radical when you think about it. Especially, traditions like that, they can be quite protective over, being true to the tradition and so on, being authentic, in inverted commas. So the idea of somebody kind of coming out of that tradition but then really using the studio to put the music together and using these instruments that you would never get in an Irish trad context is pretty radical. Um,
Yeah.
and also, being a woman using synthesizers at the time was pretty radical, which I don't know whether you're going to ask this question, but the one about the underappreciated artists, we'll maybe come back to that. But yeah, so I think my first CD was Paint the Sky with Stars by Enya. And for a while, I was ashamed to admit that because, people gave her a lot of stick. But now I'm just like, you know what? I would still listen to that today. I actually once did a concert with, there was this choir that my brother used to play percussion with. And it's like a children's choir, and they do a bunch of Enya tunes. And I did one concert with them when they needed a guitarist or something, and in this big cathedral in London. And most of the other musicians who were sort of grafted in to play on that show were just like, just ripping out of Enya. But I was like, man, I finally get to play these tunes because they are epic. They're great tunes. So, yeah. On cassette, it was probably Oasis. On CD, it was probably Enya.
Cool. Yeah, I also had a big Enya phase when I was a kid. I loved it. And yeah, every once in a while, it's still, I mean, to a certain extent, it like still feels nostalgic, but at the same time, like I still really appreciate it for what it is too.
Timeless. Yeah, I've seen a few people recently that you wouldn't necessarily expect kind of fessing up to being big Enya fans. One recently was Colin Stetson. Colin Stetson in an interview for the Quietist. They do this thing called Baker's Dozen, where you choose 13 records that have had a big impact on you. And one of Colin Stetson's was Enya, and I was like, yes, somebody else gets it.
Cool. I love that. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's one of the big reasons I love Colin Stetson is because there's, like way down buried in him is a little bit of Enya coming out.
Enya solidarity.
Yeah, Enya solidarity.
I do love Colin Stetson's music. Yeah,
he's great. What? Oh yeah, and do you know your most recent?
Are we talking about physical purchases here?
It can be digital, just like the last thing that you got.
Because I have to admit, since streaming, I basically don't buy music anymore. I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, but like just the amount of music that I listen to and deeply appreciate, I can't afford to buy it all. And if I start buying some of it, it's like that's not really fair to the other artists. So I know that doesn't really make sense, but it's like I in a way I miss the time when in order to hear music you had to buy it, because the way that affects your attitude towards the music is different.
Your appreciation.
And I can think of records that, when I was in that CD buying phase, coming back from HMV with a handful of CDs, I can think of records that I got at that time that I only got an appreciation for because I listened to them repeatedly over months. Like Ornette Coleman, for example. The first Ornette Coleman record I bought was The Shape of Jazz to Come from 1959. I bought it on a CD. I came home, I put it on. I read so much about it. He kept coming up in things that I was reading about this kind of transition from the 50s to the 60s to this free jazz movement. And I put it on and I was like, what is this? I had no connection to it. But, if I'd heard that on Spotify nowadays, that would have been the end. I'd just been like, nope, not listening to that again because there's so much other stuff to listen to. But at the time, that was my listening for a few months. Whether I liked it or not, that was the stuff that I had. And so through repeated listening, I started to get an appreciation for what they were doing, for how it differed from what had come before. Playing in a jazz quartet without piano was kind of unusual. The sort of structures of the music, his melodic sense, his tone on the saxophone, all these things just started jumping out of the music. And now I love that record, and I love Ornette Coleman's discography, and I've discovered a lot more since then. But that's how I think streaming has affected people's listening, and I lament it on the one hand, but also it's pros and cons. I've got access to so much more stuff that I would never have heard. And right now, for example, I am obsessed with Miles Davis's Electric Period from about 1968 through to about 74, 75. I'm going in really deep on his Electric Period. I'm actually kind of writing I'm just writing like some thoughts about it, but it's already about 6,000 words and like with loads of links to other stuff. So like I'm going in really heavy, and just the idea that I've got all that music available to me at the press of a button is so valuable to me as a researcher, when I'm researching music, which I do a lot of. So swings and roundabouts, as they say.
Yeah, you're one of the the few that's still willing to do the work outside of the platform and really try to understand and contextualize the music, despite just having essentially free access to everything.
Oh yeah, you should see the tabs open on my computer right now from this. Like I got the Miles Davis discography Wikipedia page, and then that's jumping out to loads of other albums, and then like academic articles written about specific tracks on Bitches Brew, for example. Like I'm really going there, and I'm really enjoying it. I don't do a lot of this, but every now and again I'll get completely obsessed with one artist, or even in this case like one period of that artist's discography, and I'll just go in really deep.
Cool. I love that. Doing that with Bjork at the moment. She's somebody who I've always appreciated, like know her hits, but have never really done a deep dive, and it's been really fruitful and really, really inspiring as well. She's a distinct artist, I think.
She's amazing. I was gutted I missed her in Kraków last year because she came through and I was out of town. But she's someone I'd love to see live as well, because listen to her records in the like late 90s, early 2000s, Post, Homogenic, like big records for me.
Yeah, I'd love to see her live as well. And you alluded to this, the underappreciated question, but that's coming. Underappreciated artist from your favorite music, say 10 years, 1 decade, favorite music decade. Who is the most underappreciated artist?
This is maybe cheating because her career spans about 70 years. She's in her 90s now. Her name is Eliane Radigue, and she's a French composer. I think probably my favorite music of hers is what she's doing right now in her like 80s and 90s. So it'd be the last decade. Plus, I think I'm generally most interested with what's happening right now, even if that is like the start of an exploration into a historical period. I don't really have a favorite decade of music, because it's kind of like saying, what's your favorite decade of food? It's like, well, food is food, music is music. So the decade bit is maybe I'm kind of eschewing that slightly, but I am going to say Eliane Radigue because she is someone who has just been pioneering for so long, and she is now finally getting the recognition that she deserves. But for so long, like nobody knew who she was. She started in the 50s. I mentioned like the idea of Enya playing synthesizers being kind of radical. That was in the 80s, but Eliane Radigue was doing this in the 50s when synthesizers were like the size of a room, and they weren't played using keyboards. They were like knobs and buttons, and you really had to understand the process, like the physical process of making sound, and oscillators and all this kind of stuff. And she was a pioneer of early electronic music, working in some of these most kind of renowned experimental studios around Europe, and created this incredible, mostly kind of drone-based electronic music way before drone was really a thing, at least in kind of Western tradition. And then around the turn of the century, by which time she's in her 70s, I guess, she switched from electronic to acoustic instrumentation, and she started composing for other musicians, which was kind of a new thing, because up to that point she was basically composing on the instruments that she knew how to operate. And the scores would just be like a reminder to herself about when to press which button and turn which knob. But then she developed this way of working closely with specific musicians and instrumentalists on acoustic music. And her acoustic music is what I want to highlight right now, that she's been making in the last sort of 15 years or so. She has a series of pieces called Occam. So it's Occam Ocean 1, 2, 3, 4. I think she's up to 4 or 5. And the way that she works with musicians, I find really interesting. And it's a process of kind of composer-performer collaboration that I'm really drawn to myself. And I didn't know of too many other people that were working like this, that are primarily known as composers, but have a way of working that's not so much about dots on a page and then handing that over, but it's more about working directly with a performer. I think what she does is she invites instrumentalists one at a time to her apartment in Paris, and they spend weeks working out the piece together. And it's a kind of oral tradition, but it's an oral tradition it's not like a folk tradition. It's an oral tradition of her own process and her own compositional methods. And that I find really interesting. It's something that I'm kind of aspiring to myself in the way that I work with other musicians. So Eliane Radigue is my underappreciated artist.
Cool. I love that. All right, and now the big question.
Oh no, I know what's coming.
I imagine you may have already prepared for as well. And I think I asked you this the first time we connected as well.
You did. I told you it was my least favorite question I've ever been asked. But I'm better prepared for it this time, I think.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'd be curious to compare it to the 3 that you said last time. But yeah, you're going to a desert island. You get to bring 3 records with you. What are they? Okay,
so I think last time, if I remember correctly, I said Miles Davis Kind of Blue, Radiohead. Do you remember? I think
you did say a Radiohead album. I think it may have been In Rainbows.
It wouldn't have been In Rainbows. It was either OK Computer or Amnesiac. I think it was probably OK Computer. It could have been either, to be fair. But I think I said Miles Davis, Radiohead. And then there was a klezmer record by Alicia Svigal's fiddle record, I think. I think that's what I said last time. So this time, because I've already said those 3, I'm going to choose 3 different ones. I am going to stick with Miles Davis, though, because I'm in this period now of like really obsessing over his electric music. This might be cheating. Tell me if it's cheating. But is a compilation allowed? Like a box set?
I mean, I've been flexible in the past in these pretend rules. So yeah, we'll
this is actually it. It's one like record that you can buy, but it's a 4 CD set. It's Miles Davis, the Columbia years, 1955 to 1985.
I think that counts. It's like a curated collection of a particular artist's music, which is like what a CD is as well. So
I'm going to go with that one because that does include some of the kind of blues stuff, but also some of this stuff from the late 60s, early 70s that I'm particularly into right now. Records like On the Corner, Jack Johnson. So I'm going to go with that one. The next one is this actually doesn't exist as a record, but if I was going to a desert island, I would have it made for me. And it's a home recording of my mum and my brother playing Schubert's Fantasia for 4 hands on the piano. I do actually have home recordings of this, but they're just on my phone. They're not on an actual record. But I would ask them to record the whole thing because I've only got fragments of it. And I'd get them to practice for a bit first because sometimes they're a bit rusty. But a home recording of my mum and my brother. They do this every Christmas when we're all together at Christmas time. They sit down at the piano and they play the Schubert Fantasia for 4 hands. And first of all, I love Schubert, and I love that particular piece of his. It's so epic, but also, I'd be able to take my family with me. If possible, there'd be a little addendum to the recording where my other brother would play something as well, or maybe I'd get him to play along. I'd do an arrangement of the Schubert for him as well, and we could all play it together. But yeah, it would be. I would want to bring my family with me.
Fair.
And then
That's a
I
good
was
answer.
thinking like, I'm on a desert island. I'm all alone. I need the human voice. And I went through so many different iterations of like, by this time, there's only going to be one record with human voice on it. Or like, what's it going to be? Who's going to be the one voice that I take, you know? And it's like, do I go with someone like Ella Fitzgerald, whose voice is like warm rays of sunshine? Or do I go with someone that really speaks closely into my ear, like Nick Drake, who's just like there with me, speaking to my internal drama? Or like, someone like Björk, whose voice just kind of anyway, I didn't go with any of them. I decided I would actually go with some choral music because, why have one voice when you can have many? And I've actually chosen Le Mystère des Voix Bulgares. It's an album by the Bulgarian State Radio and Television Female Choir.
Wow.
And it's a hauntingly beautiful record. It's one of those where, like, I mean, the clue's in the title, the mystery of Bulgarian voices, it translates it. And it's like, it is a very enigmatic record. It came out in the 80s, but it was a reissue of an earlier record from the 70s. But that one was based on earlier recordings from the 50s. Anyway, it's this collection of, and there were multiple volumes of it as well. So I'm going to go with volume 1, but it's part of a wider set. It's arrangements of traditional Bulgarian songs, folk songs for female choir. And I don't know if you're familiar with this Bulgarian choral singing, but there's a very particular timbre to the voice, particularly when you get many, often female singers together. It's just one of the most beautiful sounds you'll ever hear. So I'm going to go with that one because it's the human voice en masse. It's going to keep me company.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for all the thought you put into this question. I think it's definitely was probably the most creative answer to work.
Like I said, I'm obsessed about this, so it was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm happy to hear. And that's it. You did it. You made it through. Thank you so much, Alex, for being on here and for sharing, all of your thoughts and really supplying a lot of context to your process, both music making, music discovery, music listening. As you were saying earlier, it doesn't exist as much as it should anymore. It's at least not as easily accessible. Or the behavior of accessing context has changed as well. So, yeah, thanks.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, and thank you for providing this space to really dive into context. For those of us that value that, it's an important space. So, thanks for doing what you're doing.
Of course, I'm happy to do it. I mean, I also get to chat with other music heads and people I enjoy about music for an hour, which is great. For those who've been listening who want to listen to your music or find some of the playlists that you've made, discover music alongside you, whenever, where is the best place for them to get involved, follow along, etc., etc.?
My website is probably the hub of it all, alexrothmusic.com. I'm trying not to be too reliant on other platforms these days, like directing people to this platform and that platform, because it's kind of a dead end, and then they end up just trapped in the platform and not so engaged with what I'm doing. So yeah, head to my website and sign up to my newsletter, and I share a lot of these playlists and stuff in the newsletter, and obviously talk about what I'm up to as well with records that are coming out. So that's the place. There's also links from there to all the socials, so that's the hub of it all.
Cool. Sounds good. And then now that you've been through For the Record, who's another music head that comes to mind that would be great to have on the show?
Actually, I mentioned Martin earlier, Martin Walraven. I was trying to think to people that I know use Discord, because most of the people that I know don't use Discord. So since that's where it's happening, I was thinking, who uses Discord? And yeah, I'd be interested to hear from Martin, because we've discovered that we have a strong overlap in terms of what we're into musically. We often recommend stuff to each other. Actually, in the Zyla Discord, we have a music thread where we're kind of like recommending stuff to each other, and we've discovered our Venn diagram is there's a lot of overlap there. So I think he'd be a good one.
Yeah, you're actually not the first person to say Martin, and yeah, I'm just remembering. First, I need to go back into the Zyla Discord, and I do remember in the early days when you first created it, seeing that connection between you and Martin in that Venn diagram emerge. So yeah, that's a good reminder.
It's basically just me and him now. Everyone else has just like forgotten about it. It was just me and Martin sharing music recommendations.
I mean, that's a beautiful thing. If nothing else, to create a space for two people who didn't know that they enjoyed the same music to be able to, connect over that is well worthwhile, I think.
Get him on the show. He'd be a good one.
Yeah, will do. I need to touch base with him. Anyhow, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Alex. This has been really great. Really great catching up.
You too.
Good luck. Let me know when you come back to London the next time, and be in touch.
Great. Thanks, Keegan. Talk soon.
All right, man.
Bye now.
Bye.